Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply philosophy to everything, to current events, to controversial issues, to pretty much everything that you might confront in your daily life. And today we're going to be talking about how one evaluates historical characters. If you are on social media, and of you out there, you may see it's quite popular to evaluate a great historical character like Thomas Jefferson as a psychopathic, child molesting slave holder. Is that the appropriate way to evaluate Thomas Jefferson? Or Christopher Columbus was just an evil genocidal maniac? Is that the proper way to evaluate historical figures? Of course, we objectivists have a very different take on this than the establishment does. And very different take, I think, than the people who are countering the establishment have. And I think you will be interested in it. And here to unpack it for us is my favorite co-host on the planet, James Valliant. James, what's going on, man?
Wow, I'm doing great today. I hope you are doing well as well, sir.
I'm doing okay. I'm about to go to a jiu-jitsu class, so I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah. You know,
So, so let's
that,
unpack this, man. What's up with
yeah,
these evaluations, these characters?
consider the folks who do evaluate negatively, so negatively, and they get vicious, hardcore, negative evaluations as if they're great villains of history, men like Jefferson and Columbus. That is absurd on the face of it. And they come, mind you, these criticisms come from people on the secular left. And yet they're applying an incredibly what we objectivists would call morally intrinsicist terms of evaluation. Let's drop all context. Let's drop any historical, reality around these people. Let's judge them by our current state-of-the-art moral knowledge. And that is sheer intrinsicism. They're religious nuts. They're dogmatists. And a lot of these people will boast that they're atheists and they're secular and they're absolute religious dogmatists. Now, how do we evaluate people? Now, as objectivists, we do have a distinctive answer. We cannot refrain from morally judging people, even people in the distant past. It doesn't matter what your context is, but we don't believe free will is a magical property. It doesn't allow you to separate yourself from the context in which you were born and raised either. So we have to evaluate people in two different ways. One, morally, based on the choices that they do make. Are they pushing the ball forward, or are they negative forces in history? That can be evaluated within the context of the individual, going all the way back. I mean, let's get some real perspective here. Human beings, as objectivists say, are not born with innate knowledge. We're born tabula rasa, and nothing could prove that better than the history of humanity. Nearly all of us descend from people who were cannibals and human sacrificers. All of us. So if you were to go back in a machine thousands of years and you were to say, hey, you guys, y'all shouldn't be eating each other and y'all shouldn't be sacrificing your children to the deities, that's insane, crazy, lunacy, inhumane, monstrous, which we would obviously ascribe to that. It would be very hard to do. Something like a belief in God or gods or animism, I think was inevitable, but a mistake. Now, what do we do with these inevitable mistakes? People had to learn that only certain things were conscious in the universe. Not everything had purpose, and teleology is a fancy philosophical word. There wasn't universal teleology, and there wasn't a universal consciousness, or consciousness is out there controlling things. Our kind of consciousness applies only to humans. But that discovery, locating where consciousness is a human discovery and had to be learned. It was the first thing that's natural would be to project human consciousness onto the universe itself, and that's what happened. So do we judge people for believing in deities in the ancient world? No, we do not. But we can judge them for whether they moved the ball forward in their context. A historian who was deeply influenced by Ayn Rand, the late Robert Hesson, he was a senior fellow, Harvard and Columbia trained historian, contributor to Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. He was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution for many years, a great historian in some ways, just a brilliant one. He said to me once, the three most important words in history, Jim, are compared to what? And that is really the key thing here. So when we look at Columbus, for example, was Columbus doing a good thing? Yes, within his context. Now, there's all kinds of factual things that also make, say, a Columbus poorly misjudged, because he didn't know of the huge pandemic that would occur and wipe out over 90% of the native population. Whichever way the discovery had happened, that pandemic would have occurred, and the populations of North and South America would have been essentially wiped out from disease. And yet Columbus himself is blamed for that. Now, can we assess? I mean, look at it. When the Spanish came to the New World, we're not talking about two 21st century cultures. We're talking about two relatively primitive cultures. Only one of them, the Aztecs, still engaged in human sacrifice, for example. And the Christian world, only a few notches more advanced than them, Cortez comes to Mexico, sees children having their hearts torn out, living children having their hearts torn out on the top of temples for religious reasons. He's horrified and he wipes out the culture. And so we say, is it wrong for Cortez to have wiped out the culture? From my standpoint as a historian, I really would have loved the evidence that he destroyed about the Aztec culture as a historian. But can I understand within his context the horror of seeing a child sacrificing religion and saying, we got to wipe this out, guys? From his perspective, it was brutal, but from his perspective, understandable. Do I forgive everything Cortez did just because of that? No. But on the other hand, I'm going to cut Columbus and even Cortez a great deal of slack given their context. Now, let's take two different characters from the early 1500s. There's the famous Friar Savonarola. He saw the Renaissance happening in the 1500s. He saw Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Botticelli painting these Greek, pagan, naked people. Oh, guy, three-dimensional art. All this modern art was just worldly, pro-sex. He didn't like it. He didn't like the Medicis and their banking and their usury, which is a Christian sin, in their profit-making ways. He hated the emergence of the banking. He hated the Renaissance art. He hated Renaissance science. So we had these bonfires of the vanities, famously, where he would burn Botticelli's and burn Greek manuscripts. And yay, this is a good thing to do. Compare him to another Christian contemporary of his. Let's go up to England this time, a guy named Thomas More. I can't really blame someone for being a Christian in the early 1500s. In fact, I think it would be unreasonable to expect someone, even an honest person, intellectually honest person, to be able to avoid a belief in God, and in Europe specifically, a Christian belief. Thomas More was willing to die simply on a matter of principle on these Christian beliefs. Now, and he didn't go around destroying the new humanism of England and Holland at the time, the people he was interacting with. So if I were to compare two sincere Christians from the 1500s, I could make the moral evaluation. Savonarola is the voice of the Dark Ages, dragging us back from the Renaissance, or trying to. Thomas More was a sincere humanist, expressing the ideas, at least the best ideas of his time, in a certain way, although I don't agree with his politics, all kinds of errors in his Platonic Christianity and so forth. But there was a man who put his money where his mouth was and obviously sincerely believed it, to the point he was willing to die for it. So I think we can evaluate these people, but we have to evaluate them within their context. Take Napoleon. I understand that in November, the great director Ridley Scott, and I do regard him as maybe the greatest living film director of our time, the great director of film time, big fan. It's really interesting because he did a biopic on Columbus too, about 30 years ago, called 1492. Magnificent film with Gerard Depardieu. Totally hero worships Columbus. It's right in the face of all this left-wing attack on Columbus, and I highly recommend the movie. Because it describes Columbus as a hero within his context, pushing the boundaries of knowledge forward, getting people to do. He was brave. Talk about someone who had the courage of his convictions and willing to go out in the middle of nowhere, risk his life to make this new discovery. And that was the real discovery, not the Vikings. Although the Vikings got to Canada, it had no real historical impact. Whereas Columbus set off this worldwide event where people were traveling and colonizing the whole world, repopulating the depopulated Americas, for example. So I think these figures have to be judged in context. I haven't seen, obviously, the Napoleon movie. It hasn't been released, but I've heard that people are questioning. He's got Joaquin Phoenix, who did a great job in Gladiator, too. Another one of my favorite Ridley Scott films. Coming back playing Napoleon, and it's basically about Napoleon and Josephine. How do we evaluate? And I wonder how Ridley Scott's going to evaluate Napoleon, because very mixed bag, but I think largely on the negative side. I mean,
Yes.
really largely on the negative side.
Yes.
At first, he was a part of the French Revolution. And as we all know, the French Revolution, at least a lot of people should know, the French Revolution decayed into this terrible reign of terror, this monstrous attack, a murderous attack led by men like Robespierre. Order was brought to that. A sort of republican order was brought to that, so that the ideals throwing out the old monarchy could be better established, maybe more like America. So that when this General Napoleon from Corsica says, I'm the consul of this new French Republic, everyone said, yeah, he's like the Roman consuls of old. He's a hero. Famously, the composer Beethoven, who was a political liberal in his own time, admired Napoleon at that point. He is bringing he will bring liberty, he will bring progress to France and the continent of Europe. But in 1804, Napoleon declared himself emperor, and he started causing wars. And Beethoven was shattered. And the Third Symphony, maybe one of the most revolutionary pieces of music ever written, he had first dedicated to Napoleon, the Bonaparte. This is it. But when he finds out, when a buddy tells him Napoleon's declared himself emperor, he tears up the dedication page. Before it's all over, the dedication will be to the memory of a great man. And so it changes from the Bonaparte Symphony to the Eroica, the heroic symphony. Now, let's evaluate that. Here's someone within Napoleon's own context, morally evaluating him by standards that are perfect. They're Beethoven's, obviously. He's not an objectivist. On the other hand, were Beethoven's standards of political evaluation correct in its context? Yes. The fact that you could have a great man like Beethoven calling you out Napoleon tells you Napoleon can be negatively judged within his own context. Or take George Washington versus Napoleon. George Washington wins a war. He quits as general. He lays down. He's first president of the United States. He quits after 2 terms, says, no, I don't want to be an emperor. If you've got a Washington at the same time as a Napoleon, it provides a moral contrast, which allows us to morally evaluate them. Obviously, as we go back further and further in time, we have less and less information to evaluate people on. And it's hard enough with people I know in the 21st century. I really, in some cases are easy. You can know something, oh, that's really bad or that's really good. But in a lot of cases, morally judging people is the most complicated thing we can do. And you really have to get to know them really well. And as you go back in time, we get less and less personal information about these people's contexts. And so it becomes harder and harder. On the other hand, there are certain figures, I think, and as objectivists, as I say, there's no excuse for not morally judging when we can. We should make these moral evaluations, but those evaluations should be contextual, not intrinsicist, dogmatic, which even our atheist friends will engage in when evaluating historical figures. Thomas Jefferson, as we were saying in a recent previous podcast, did more to eliminate slavery. I mean, the world was filled with slavery in his time. It was economically built into so much of the world and world trade. The British Empire still hadn't gotten rid of the slave trade in their international empire until well into the 1830s. To evaluate someone just for having slaves, but I mean, I'm going to also make some nuanced arguments here. George Washington could afford to liberate his slaves upon his death. Thomas Jefferson could not and did not. Is there a moral difference there? Well, it was a question of affordability in Jefferson's case, but he still did it. Now, evaluating, say, a Sally Hemings case, that is a difficult thing. In fact, entering anyone's personal life and personal relationships becomes, even if you do have the data to prove your case, becomes very tricky in my mind. I do not have enough facts, simply, even if Jefferson had a relationship with this slave, Sally Hemings, I simply do not have enough facts, even in a slave context, to evaluate that morally in certain significant ways. He took care of her, gave her a very humane treatment. It may have been a relative of his who was sleeping with her. But without getting into all the details of that controversy, the point is we don't have the data. And when we don't have the data to morally evaluate someone, just like if I don't have the data to morally evaluate a mixed bag in the 21st century, I say I don't know. And it's not fair for me to enter into that without the appropriate context of data. But the bottom line is we have to morally evaluate when we can, when we have enough data to do so. There's no excuse to evade moral evaluation, but that moral evaluation has to respect the historical context. You know, if people thought 500 years ago that slavery was inevitable, it's just the way it's going to be. Believing in slavery is itself not a moral issue, in my view. As time moves on, say you got John Locke in the late 1600s saying, no, slavery is wrong, it's immoral. When you start getting arguments like that, then we can start to evaluate people. Starting with
But Jefferson as well made those arguments, but I think it's important to note, and this isn't a butt that forgives, the kind of moral games he had to play with himself. He was in a very difficult position as a representative of the United States of America, as a diplomat and as a slaveholder himself. Yeah. He understood the institution to be brutal and also like a wild beast that you had by the ears. You couldn't let go of it. As much as he wanted to initiate some form of emancipation, he understood it as a very dangerous proposition for lots of people. And so it was a thing he hoped would finally pass out of existence of its own, but that wasn't the case in the South. So all I'm saying by that is his history is an extremely complex phenomenon, and it can't be just simplistically framed the way the people on the left want to do it today.
He really tried to get slavery into the Declaration. He really believed it to be a pernicious thing. He knew it contradicted the ideals of the founding of America. And when he got older, he said, and he also knew the trouble that was brewing, at least could sense it. He said, I tremble with fear for the future of my country when I think about the future of the enslaved Africans. Now think about that. He knew the trouble was brewing and it wasn't going to be an easy fix. And truly, if you think about American history, that was prescient, wasn't it? Our treatment of African Americans has been the great problem and shame, if you will, on the black mark on the history of the noblest country in all of human history. So even when we evaluate a country like America, we can say, oh, by far the most moral country that has ever existed in its original principles and in its original practice, still they had dramatic contradictions and problems. And we're still working those contradictions out.
But might I note, I think in America's favor, that we seem to be the only country who acknowledges those contradictions and attempts to fix them. And that is saying something. So look, what I'm gathering from this is the way you evaluate historical characters contextually. You evaluate them contextually according to what they knew at the time, but also what makes them the same as their culture doesn't make them historical. The fact that Columbus was a brutal governor doesn't make him an historical figure. It makes him very much like everyone else around him. What makes him different is that he had a vision of the world that he heroically pursued in the face of obstacles that would daunt and cow any normal human being, and he did it, and he set off an age of exploration that changed the face of the world. We likewise don't judge Jefferson by the fact that he was like every other landed gentry in Virginia. We judge him by the fact that he put forth concepts with respect to human liberty that have liberated millions upon millions of people and serve as the template that even the people on the left use to judge right or wrong today, even though they don't admit it. And Napoleon, I tend to think that military heroes are often admired for some good qualities put in a bad context. I don't necessarily admire them. So I'd like to see how Napoleon will be judged by Ridley Scott as well. But
I think I'm certain Napoleon became joined his own cult, People so admired Napoleon and what he was doing and bringing order after the French Revolution that he really bought into it. I'm something, and the normal rules don't apply to me. As I understand Napoleon, as his life went on, he just thought he had the answer and he was going to do it, and force didn't matter, and he was going to break all the eggs necessary for that self-aggrandizement. That's why at the end of the day, I negatively evaluate him. As I say, you can compare him negatively based on the evaluations of other Europeans like Beethoven, or comparison with George Washington. Those are the kind of contextual comparisons, right? Compared to what? And is the figure here pushing it forward, or is he pushing us back? And from that context, is he improving matters, or is he trying to send us back to a worse time? So for example, today, if you're an environmentalist leader, I think you are a villain. Now, not your average teenager who joins environmentalist group, students, young people, the masses who don't think about it. But these intellectual leaders of the environmentalist movement are truly nihilists, are truly evil people trying to bring us undo civilization and industry and science and take us back to the Paleozoic era.
I've often said to people who say, well, look, Martin Luther King was a socialist. And I would say back to them, well, I can understand that in the 1960s when America had betrayed the African American and the only people who seemed to be offering a vision of equality were the socialists. Hey, I get where he's coming from. But after the wall fell, after all of the archives were released to everyone, opened up for the world to see how despicable this ideology is, you have to be engaged in some serious evasion to think that socialism is an ideal economic, political, social system today.
I agree with you. Some of my favorite writers from the past 100 years or so have identified as socialists. They were great writers. I could understand their sympathy, especially if they were opposed to, for example, the anti-Stalinist types. There may be something idealistic about socialism, but these Russian communist experiment that we all thought was wonderful has gone south on us. I would urge people to look at the intellectuals who formed the intellectual right in America in the 20th century, by the way. Nearly all of them were former communists and socialists. Seeing the experience of totalitarianism, and especially in the 1940s, when the truth about Stalin came to light and people were aware of the Holocaust, from that moment forward, advocates of socialism, I think, were in a critical spot where their honesty was being tested. And you look at all the great communist leaders, Max Eastman, the editor of The Masses, the guy that sent John Reed to watch the Bolshevik Revolution. He went from being the editor of the communist periodical The Masses to being a friend of Ludwig von Mises and an advocate of Austrian economics by the 1940s.
He didn't have anything to do with the ACLU, did he?
Yes, he did. He and his sister.
So I played him in Hemingway and Gellhorn, by the way.
That was you? I saw Hemingway and Gellhorn, and of course Max Eastman shows up in Reds. He shows up like even you in the form of you in the story about Gellhorn and Hemingway. Oh man, I didn't realize that was. I didn't even recognize that as you.
So wait a minute.
Hemingway's a great example. Hemingway's buddy, the novelist John Dos Passos, they both were in the Spanish Civil War together in the 1930s. A friend of theirs gets killed by the commies. I get a little emotional about this one. A friend of theirs, mutual friend of the novelists, Dos Passos and Hemingway, gets killed by the commies. Katie Dos Passos, the wife of John Dos Passos, says, Ernest, aren't you going to be honest about this? Ernest Hemingway, no, we're going to defend the communists even when they murder our friends. And Katie Dos Passos said, that's the most opportunistic thing I've ever heard, Ernest. And those two novelists who were best buds then broke. Dos Passos became a Goldwater Republican and started writing the New Republic.
No, I didn't know that.
The National Review, whereas Hemingway remained a commie sympathizer to the day he committed suicide. So,
hey, you know what? There's this juxtaposition that you've been talking about, where people drop context. and believe something in the present day that maybe somebody believed in the past, they're excused, but in the present day, it's not excusable. I have to say, we witnessed this when Elia Kazan got his Lifetime Achievement Award, I think the Cecil B. DeMille Award, and there were certain actors, older actors, who refused to stand and applaud for him. Now, Kazan, for people who
There was
don't
a
know,
whole
is
protest outside the Academy Awards. You saw there were hundreds of protesters.
Insanity. Yeah. So look, for people who don't know, Elia Kazan was one of the greatest American directors of all time. Now, he got his start in a seminal theater company in the United States called the Group Theater. Now, they were an ideologically cemented collective, which meant, of course, they were extremely socialist, and they decided to present plays in the socialist ilk, that sort of commandeered issues of the times and dramatized them on stage. And they became very famous. And many of the people out of that Group Theater influenced all of the acting that we see today. So if you like De Niro, if you like Pacino, if you like Brando, if you like any of these people that changed American acting, it was the people in the Group Theater that were responsible for them. Kazan being one of the greatest. Now, Kazan was understood from the inside what the communists were trying to do, because they were attempting to force him to produce content that was favorable to communists. He broke with this because he's an artist, and eventually testified before the Committee on Un-American Activities, and from that point forward was blackballed. Now, even in the 50s, it's hard for me to understand, because Stalin was already out. People already knew that he was a terrible person. People already knew that communism was a massive failure. So the fact that he was blackballed then is still not understandable, but somewhat more understandable than the people in the 21st century who refuse to stand for this icon of American cinema, because they still cling to this idea that the blacklist and the hunt for communism in the 1950s and communists was somehow a witch hunt that this man participated in and somehow gave up his soul in order to for his career. To me, he had the biggest soul of them all.
You got it. These lefties don't mind canceling people for their ideology. No, what they objected to was attacking communists. And in nearly every case, these people were actually card-carrying communists, and it can be proved. And communism was all the rage for artists and intellectuals in the 1930s. And many of them were associated with communism, flat out provable. And the American Communist Party was financially supported by Moscow. When Moscow stole the secret of the atomic bomb from us, using spies in the US Army to get it, mind you, and put the world under this threat of Cold War, is it unreasonable to say, hey, if Jack Warner or Louis B. Mayer doesn't want to hire communist writers, is there something wrong with that? Oh, no, Dalton Trumbo has to hire, but he's kept, notice, even a figure like Dalton Trumbo kept working just under a different name. Kirk Douglas lets him put his name on Spartacus, and Kirk Douglas is a hero. But of course, he kept working. But private corporate censorship was terrible back in those days. That was McCarthyism. Today, canceling people for having ideas that the left don't like, well, we can ruin their career, but no big deal. No big deal. So it ain't the idea of focusing on people for ideology that ever disturbed the left, it seems to me. They were outright defending communists. And how dare you attack communists at the time? Elia Kazan had inside knowledge and knew communists, and they'll never forgive him because he, quote, named names. But he is one of the great, we were saying this in a podcast we did just the other day. I think that films are the great artwork of our time. I think they are the Mona Lisas and the Sistine Chapels of our time. And someone like Elia Kazan is going to be remembered for centuries to come, and not because he turned in communists. For that, he's an honest man, it seems to me. And one of these people who had the honesty in the compared to what context of his own time to say, no, I object to that. That's bad. That takes courage, and it took a great deal of courage. So I regard someone like Elia Kazan as just simply a hero, even if my aesthetic standards are slightly different.
I agree with you, but I don't think that he ever had the moral compass to be able to navigate that territory successfully. If you read his biography, I think there's a massive portion of him that feels like a Judas, and he never quite got over that. So I'm sure those people who didn't stand were in some way affecting him, cutting him to the quick. But in deference to Martin Scorsese, he introduced him. He stood up there with him like an artist and a filmmaker. So irrespective of whether I like Martin Scorsese content and the people that he chooses to focus on, he had balls to get up there in front of the rest of Hollywood and stand up for a real hero. But wait a minute. Now we've talked about decontextualization. We've talked about one side in particular. I think both sides decontextualize history in order to promote whatever their agenda is. But what is the reason, do you think, behind this push to characterize American heroes in particular as the worst villains in history, and to characterize America as the worst, most villainous country in history? There has to be an overarching purpose to this, because it's an organized, committed attack. And what do you think that purpose may be?
Well, my answer is going to be that the leaders of this movement are not honest people. They do not like they're enemies of civilization. They're enemies of reason. They're enemies of freedom. They're enemies of everything that made America the most moral country that has ever existed in history, at least in its original conception and practice. And to see the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity, the liberal revolution of the Enlightenment in the 19th century that wiped out slavery and gave us freedom of speech and dramatically started to improve the social conditions and the economic conditions and the physical well-being of human beings, to see the best thing that ever happened to humanity in an evil light, which is what they have systematically. They've retrained themselves to think that capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the liberal revolution of the Enlightenment, and so forth, were bad things. Bad things. We don't want, and so the left is really a crusaders on this. They are opponents. We were saying just the other day, we were talking about the Constitution. They're opponents of the Equal Protection Clause that was designed to protect free slaves. They're opponents of the First Amendment censorship rules. They want censorship. It's quite plain, and they have no problem with government dictating content. That's what's become of the left today. So they are, in my view, immoral, because compared to what? Yeah, they have a better context. They can know better. There is all kinds of knowledge. Hey, wait a minute. There's an Ayn Rand out there. If there's an Ayn Rand out there and you're being dishonest about not checking it out, that I can hold you to. Guess what? There are better ideas. Just like I can go back and compare George Washington and Napoleon, so in the 21st century, I can compare those guys who hate America and everything it stands for, and the giant factual evasion that they're engaged in, inhuman factual evasion that they're engaged in, and judge it negatively. They have better information available. There are better voices out there. They should know better at this point. And so, yeah, the intellectual leaders I negatively evaluate.
Might I say one of the most intelligent things King George III ever said was that if Washington gave up the reins of power, he would be the greatest man in history. And he is the greatest man in history. People don't understand what an incredible achievement just that was. Somebody relinquishing power peacefully, and then that power transferring peacefully, not just one generation, but multiple generations. That is an unprecedented event, and it was made possible by somebody who truly embodied the Republican ideals. I have a few super chats here. Jonathan Honig with $2.99. Thanks, Jonathan. It's always good to see you out there. Mary Aline with $3. Thank you, dear. It's always great to see you watching. Honig with another 99 cents. Thank you, Jonathan. Catherine with $1.99. She's a new member, by the way. May be obvious, but today is Bastille Day. That's right.
That's right. My goodness.
Today is the day. My wife is there right now. Today is the day that the
I was in Paris for Bastille Day, and it's a fun day to be in Paris. Yeah, right. Even with all the violence going on in France right now, Bastille Day is always a fun day to be in Paris. I'll never forget it.
It was the day when an infamous prison was taken down brick by the people, and it's too bad they didn't embody a Lockean revolution instead of a Rousseauian revolution. France might be a very different place if that were the case.
They ended up with a Napoleon, not a Jefferson, didn't they?
What's that?
Well, if you look at it, when they were the contemporary periods of their rule, American Revolution, we ended up with a Jefferson in the early 1800s. France ended up with a Napoleon in the early 1800s.
Yes, they did. And glory to America for that. Mary Eileen, $5. Jefferson spent extravagantly. He was still heroic in many ways, but his spending affected his ability to free his slaves. That's absolutely true. He wasn't the only
Well,
slaver who was in debt, a founder who was in debt. Madison was as well.
may I
They
just
had
give
lots
a
of
little
problems.
defense for Jefferson there? Jefferson
Yeah.
Jefferson didn't like, when he was president, and even when he was vice president, didn't like to do things on the taxpayer dime. So things that are done today at the White House, entertaining foreign dignitaries, doing official stuff, partying, stocking the wine cellar at the White House, stocking the Library of Congress with books. Yeah, it's true. The man was a shopaholic when it came to his beloved Spanish Madeira wine or his books. But man, the guy gave us the nucleus of the Library of Congress. The man, through his own finances, paid for a lot of official things when he was in office. And yeah, that put him behind the eight ball. Which would have been better? What would have been the, put it on the taxpayers or pay it myself and then end up more in debt so I can't free myself? That's a complex thing, it seems to me. But yeah, if you're a spendthrift to that extent, I mean, most people are mixed bags. But the question is, with their mixed bags and some of their poor, I think I've made some poor judgments in the course of my life that I sort of regret. And so even in that sense, I'm a mixed bag, although I think my heart's always been in the right place. I hope so. But the point is that it's hard to evaluate on this. So what we have to do is look at them overall. What was the net effect of all of Jefferson's doings? I think it was
The language of the Declaration,
side.
the language of the Declaration even informs authoritarian regimes that they have a certain language they have to stick to if they want to pretend to be working for the interests of the
He
people.
got rid of entail, primogeniture. He got rid of all that stuff in France. What he did within Virginia created sort of a model that was followed by the American Bill of Rights. As president, he cut the size of government. He cut the budget of government. He said, a wise and frugal government which will restrain men from injuring one another, but which will otherwise leave them free to pursue their own industry and improvement. Wow.
I love that you just quoted Jefferson as if it was a Bible verse. I think if more people did that, the world would be in a better place. Hey, wait a minute. I just want to say something by way of illustrating how unwieldy and unfortunate our government has become. In Jefferson's day, I think the executive office was occupied by all of 4 employees. Okay. Today, guess how many employees the executive employs, and we're not talking about just deep state, alphabet soup agencies. Just in the interests of advancing the president's agenda, how many people do you think are employed in that?
It went from dozens to must have been hundreds.
4,000 people. 4,000 people.
That is
and
obscene.
You cut.
That's obscene because it reflects just how complex and intrusive, filled with unnecessary laws and agencies our government has become.
Indeed. Give me the four employees.
Yeah.
Be better off. Alejandro with £4.99. Another example of Beethoven's republicanism is the tipping cap incident in Teplitz with Goethe, although it's probably apocryphal. Do you know this?
Does not come to mind. I'm sorry, Alejandro, my brother. I can't. It doesn't come to mind. I know he was an associate. He met on multiple occasions Goethe and Schiller. I mean, he was very much an intellectual figure of his time, and definitely in with that crowd. I cannot, for the life of me, think of the story that you're referring to, Alejandro. I'm sorry.
Nor can I, but it sounds like interesting. I want to know more. And I think this might be Daniel writing this in the American Cincinnatus. Yes, that was George Washington, the American Cincinnatus. And in fact, they started an organization around Cincinnatus where.
For those who don't know, Cincinnatus was a hero of the early Roman Republic who became dictator. Was an office within the Republic. If there was an invasion, a war, a crisis, they'd elected this dictator for a limited period of time. And it was usually for a period of 1 year. And when it came close to the empire, Julius Caesar was declared dictator for life. So I say that was an unprecedented move. And the Roman Republic is falling apart. But before that, in the early days of the Republic, there was this farmer, became dictator, kicked the enemy's ass, gave up office, quit as general, went back to his plow, went back to his farm. And so the analogy there is this Republican leader from the ancient Roman Republic, Cincinnatus. And when you think about it, that's a really, going back to the ancient world is a really interesting kind of comparison. I mean, think of a figure like, see, even a first century BC figure like Cicero. He's arguing, he loves Aristotle. He says, read your Aristotle. He's a believer in the republicanism. He's a believer in a crude understanding of rights, an early nebulous understanding of individual rights. He was a pioneer of, and he was so inconvenient to the new dictatorial forces that were coming to Rome to make it an empire that Mark Antony had his hands severed from his body and nailed to the Senate wall.
And his head, let's not forget. All of those were nailed to the rostrum, I think, in the Roman Forum, where Cicero would probably hold forth for the population of Rome. But I think it's great that our American founders were worshipers of that early Roman Republic, and the Society of Cincinnati was supposed to reflect those Republican ideals. Daniel says he can tell the Beethoven Goethe story if we want to hear it. You want to hear that?
Daniel, please do. Yeah.
Come on in.
Yeah, so it happened in the town Teplitz, and apparently, so Beethoven was there for a while, and he met with Goethe, and just 2 quick lines so I can kind of summarize his republicanism. So the first line is, supposedly the two men, meaning Beethoven and Goethe, were walking together one day when the arrival of the imperial party interrupted them. Goethe is said to have moved aside, deferentially removing his cap, bowing deeply. Beethoven continued on through the crowd unmoved, tipping his cap only with barely concealed contempt.
Nice. Beethoven hated monarchy. He hated monarchy. He thought that when he thought Napoleon was a hero, it's because he had brought some order after the French Revolution, and that meant the end of the Ancien Regime. That's it. The old kings are gone. So that when Napoleon declared himself emperor, that was it. Tear up the dedication. The man's an asshole now. That's that. Now, that kind of moral I love that kind of moral judgment, first of all. Just as an objectivist, the fact that his evaluative mechanism is so well greased that he's willing to give a black and white judgment to this guy when he declares himself emperor. I admire that. I admire that enormously. And you know, some of these artists from the early Romantic period are real life heroes. Men like Victor Hugo, men like Beethoven, whatever you think of their art. Hugo, obviously, my favorite novels, apart from Ayn Rand's, were written by Hugo. But and Beethoven, I'm a big fan of Beethoven, unlike Ayn Rand. But the point is, whatever you think of their art, they were heroes within their own context, aesthetically or politically. That's something a lot of people don't know.
And
no surprise. I wish more artists were like that today. I think we'd have a grander scope out there. What were you going to say, Daniel?
Just a quick second line. So the reason for it, also Beethoven apparently had a disgust for Goethe's position at the Weimar court, and later Edmund Morris writes about Beethoven that at this stage of his career, Beethoven clearly believed with Spinoza and Schiller that the creative artist should strive neither for royal favor nor for the love of God, but only for works of rational beauty that would inspire and improve humanity.
I just got the chills. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. You know, and in fact, biographically, Beethoven was an interesting figure in terms of making artistic patronage in music more capitalistic. He was the first composer to sell his sheet music and to be a private guy and to avoid royal patronage. Yes, he gave music. He was a music instructor, piano teacher to the children of rich families on occasion, but he attempted to avoid royal patronage and live on the selling of his sheet music like a capitalist. I'm not exaggerating. Beethoven was actually a person who helped bring artistic patronage at the time into a more capitalistic era.
That's pretty amazing. And when you combine that with the fact that he was a sufferer of Meniere's, an inner ear disease that I actually have, it's a terrible, terrible affliction, that he was able to do it in a time when there was no medication and no therapeutic treatment for it, and persevere and write in the face of
composer.
deafness.
Unbelievable. A composer going deaf. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely unbelievable. Yeah.
Well, folks, I think we've touched the heroic today, and we've touched, I think, a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed today, and that is judge historical characters in their context and judge how they have progressed or advanced society. How influential are their ideas in changing things for the better? And that's how you come to a proper moral evaluation of historical figures. Objectivists are the most judgmental people in the world. I think that's a fantastic thing. And yet some of these people who are now considered historical villains are not in our eyes, and not because we're just rich white patriarchs trying to disseminate, our own version of power down on top of you at the lower end of things, but because we see life from a rational perspective, and we understand that the only way you can be rational is to hold context in your vision when you are thinking about things, particularly in the past. Well, as usual, James, this has been a great show. I've really enjoyed working with you as usual. We have no upcoming shows afterwards, folks. Go ahead.
You're muted, James.
I'm
You're
just-
muted. Oh.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just glad that I understand your colleagues are all on strike, Mr. Pellegrino. I'm just glad that it doesn't include this. So yeah, always fun and enlightening to talk to you, sir. You always give me one of my favorite conversations. Folks, if you like these conversations, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. We exist. You guys keep on the lights. We exist because of you. So if this kind of conversation, if creating a worldwide community of students of objectivism you think is an important value, then definitely become a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK and keep us going and keep this stuff happening.
Indeed, objectivism is the solution to the tribalism out there, folks. And remember that, and always remember to check your premises. Peace.